All right. Well, hello. Hi, Paul. Hi, Philip. Thank you for hanging out today. Thank you for coming to see us. It's great to see everyone's faces again.
Hey, nice to see you as well. Happy to be here.
Um, so I'm going to start. I'll ask each one of you a question that gives you an opportunity to introduce yourself as well. So please tell us about your background, anything that you need to tell us about. And Philip, I will start with you. I remember when Cypress 10 came out, you wrote some of the first early blog posts determining, what is this? What is the impact of this? And I know that you've also taught courses around development with Vue component testing and work like that. So I would like you to introduce yourself and then also just tell us a little bit about your component testing experience, teaching about it. What do people need to learn about it when you find you talk to them?
Thank you. That's a lot. I might get back to you on
Yeah, let's
on some
start
of
with the
the
introduction and
sub
I can ask you
questions you
the
have
next part later.
asked. Yeah, so my name is Philip. I'm an educator. I love testing and working with Cypress, writing tests. And I like to teach it as well. That's why I have the blog you mentioned and the courses you have mentioned as well. And overall, my experience with component testing, I would say I'm still starting. I'm not really confident teaching component testing very much because it's a whole another area of testing. If you're writing test automation scripts to sort of create these end-to-end flows, you approach your software like a user, and it doesn't really matter which framework your application is written in. With component tests, the story is slightly different. You get very much entangled with the nuts and bolts of the framework. But I think this is ultimately a good thing. Me as a person that came to tech about 7 years ago and had to go through that journey, component testing was a really good opportunity to dive even deeper into the code. So I guess that sort of sums up my experience. And yeah, I guess I'll hand it over to you if you have no additional questions.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we will come back to some of that. But Paul, how about you can introduce yourself and I'll do you a favor and split up the question of like introduce yourself and then I'll ask you my intro question.
Okay, that's great. Thanks. Hi, guys. So my name is Paul de Wit. I'm from the Netherlands. Since last year, also Cypress Ambassador. And I've had the good fortune as a freelance test automation expert to use Cypress in multiple ways, from end-to-end API testing, but also isolated front-end testing. And then component testing came about. And I was working for a client, an insurance company, who was very interested in creating their own component library with lit elements. And that was something that was not yet available in the Cypress framework. So me and one of the front-end developers, we created a custom mount function for it, and we implemented it. And I think one of the most interesting parts about the component testing is actually the discussion of how is this placed in an organization in the software development lifecycle, because there are a lot of technical people, of course, like developers who do a lot of unit tests, which also there is like a gray area between components and unit testing. But at the same way, there are a lot of testers out there who are not technically equipped enough to write component tests, but do write end-to-end tests. And from what I've seen is that some companies ask them to write component tests as well. So that's also quite an interesting thing what's happening, actually. So there's actually some things that I'm very interested in how you can manage to set everything up in a way that is preferable for the company and also a pragmatic approach.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And you touched on what was going to be my question as well. There were several people in the chat so far and ahead of time as well who mentioned using lit. I wasn't as aware that like lit was so popular. It seems to be having a bit of a moment. So I wondered about if you could tell us, what you had to do to create a custom mount command, or even higher level, just like why you chose to create a custom command for something that's not directly built into Cypress, and was that still useful to you?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. Well, the thing was, one of the lead front-end developers is kind of an evangelist for the company, and he prefers Lit because of its independence, being a basic web component with its own state of like a shadow state for CSS and everything and classes. And they were very adamant about using it, actually. So they were already implementing everything about it. And some of the other testers that were already working for the company also were working with Cypress to write end-to-end tests, also from a legacy perspective for Angular frameworks. And they asked me if it was possible for me to set up component testing to achieve this. Well, I do like a technical challenge, so I thought, well, you know what, it's quite interesting to see if I can pull this off. So basically what we did was we created, Lit actually comes with its own tool set for testing and everything, and dev server, but we actually used Vite to write this, to set up a dev server, and we only had to write or overwrite, I should say, the mount function. So we could actually inject our own elements in the HTML file Cypress uses for its components. So it was not that difficult to set everything up, actually. But we did counter some interesting things about how it's loaded and how it refreshed and everything. So that were more the difficult challenges on a technical level.
Yeah, very cool. And this was before, for people who are not aware, there is now a sort of standardized format for defining custom frameworks. If you're one of the people who answered there was quite a list of non-Vue, React, Angular things. If you're one of those people who answered that, we have documentation you can find about integrating custom things like that, like you might do for Lit Element or Solid or other things. There are some frameworks adapters that are popping up in the community already, so you can search on NPM. But also, yeah, if you dive into the docs, you can learn how to do that for yourself. All right, I would like to sort of ask one question now and ask each of you to respond to the same question. And Murat, you've already introduced yourself, so let's start this kind of round with you, and then Philip, I'll ask you to go after Murat. And I want to start with, when you're introducing other people to component testing, what is something that they find difficult to understand or get, and that you find you have to explain or you find helpful to explain early in teaching someone component testing?
One thing is that from the RTL or JES side, right? Most people aren't very familiar with MSW. So they've been, at least at Exxon, they're not. And they've been backing a lot of the components using just FN. And it's kind of a case of you have marked 80% of the component with all these dependencies, all these hooks, and you're testing very little of it, right? Trying to explain not to test these or mock out these implementation details, trying to mock at a higher level using Cypress. So once they understand Cypress, it's a very nice API, right? So get request, gets this. Once they handle that, and it was coupled with custom mounts, right? We made it very easy to mount the component. There are 3 custom mounts that we use between different applications. And one of them is just with styles. One of them is with the Redux store, and then one of them has all the bells and whistles, right? So you're gonna always use the most extreme one. It will work everywhere, but it kind of communicates, hey, what do I really need in this component, right? Just one of those, and then use Cypress themselves. When they figured this out, the rest was very easy. And then they started looking at the same test in Enzyme and RTL versus SciCT. It's half the length with so much less work, and they can see the browser and they can ad hoc it, right? The lucky part was that everyone was familiar with Cypress end-to-end because we've been using it for a year, and we've been trying to shift left, have developers use lots of Cypress, both in UI testing and API testing. So the sell was quite easy.
Cool, thank you. So Philip, yeah, what is something that you find useful to teach early when you talk about component testing?
Yeah, so I mostly teach people that are either in testing or are junior developers, so more leaning to like the junior level. What I think is like the whole new idea is actually introducing them to the component structure as a new concept, right? Because if you're going from that user experience, like when you first just click through the web and you don't really know what's happening inside, then knowing that you have these components, these like Lego blocks of your application that can be tested in isolation, that it in itself is a new concept. So when I teach, I usually go through these different steps, and when you have steps, you need to make sure that they are not too high, and each one builds on the one that has been before. So this is like an introduction, which is of course easy to get, right? It's not a hard thing to understand. What becomes harder is actually the part when we get to coding, and that was actually a hard part for me as well. Because when you take these Lego blocks, these components individually, and you try to mount them, your first experience might be, oh, it does not work. Well, each of the components is sometimes, well, not every time, but it can happen pretty often that the component actually needs to be provided with some sort of something, right? You can have your router, you can have some storage state manager thing. The very first thing you might need is the CSS styling that will be missing if you mount your component for the very, very first test, right? And going through these steps one by one and trying to find a good way to explain that step by step is like the biggest challenge. But ultimately, I think it creates this very nice aha moments when suddenly you feel like you actually start to understand what's happening inside your application. And while there may be different levels of complexities, you'll get like a unique insight that is like a very good first step into understanding like the web development overall. So I'm optimistic about the about the things that might be perceived as hard, especially at the beginning.
That's a great point. Those first like few minutes where you might have chosen a component from your own application and said, oh, well, let me test my complicated checkout form with all these animations and stuff like that. And you load it up and it doesn't have anything like the appearance you want because there's no CSS.
Or it gives you an error, which you just cannot read because it's just like trying to read this thing of undefined and you like don't even know where to start.
Right. It's a missing prop and your component doesn't know how to render without it. So it's a good point for people who are about to have their first experience of component testing to pick a small, probably UI focused like presentational component. We use buttons and links a lot because they're so easy to understand the concept and the purpose of those types of components. And it does scale up, but the more scaffolding you have to do before you actually render your component, the further you are from that good experience of, okay, I get the development cycle now.
Yeah. And you can actually collaborate with your developers and ask them what would be the component to start with. What's the simplest one that's maybe an on and off switch or something like that. That could be like a really great way to create the path for yourself with collaboration with developers.
Yeah. And thank you. And so Paul, sort of same question to you, perhaps working with clients, like what is the information that they need about component testing as you're getting somebody ramped up?
Yeah, that's interesting because I hear a lot of technical things. And of course that is true because it actually, you have to be a little bit more technical to write component tests and to write end-to-end tests, I believe. Because you have to understand the inner workings of HTML, something you also showed today. But also, I think it's very interesting to see that test scoping is actually an issue often. Because whenever testers are asked to write a component test instead of end-to-end tests, they often don't have an idea where to stop. So they still have to follow the end-to-end mindset. You know, they click on a button, they try to go to the page that should be loaded, or something like that, or if they have to upload a file, what's happening then? And I think that's kind of interesting because what you talked about earlier about testing vertically, that's actually what you're doing. So, and that's actually what I spend the most time on is actually test scoping, teaching others how to scope their test cases to write component testing. When I started using Cypress, we didn't have, well, it was like Cypress, it was just out of beta, I think. But it was like two subjects. You had end-to-end, you had integration testing. And I actually, what I found is that I could integration test my front end isolated with the intercepts, of course. So that's actually how I try to obtain a shift left approach for companies. And component testing goes even a step further, but it's a completely different mindset for testers to use it. And the same go actually if you go to developers, the same thing, because if you ask developers to write component tests instead of unit tests, because there's a lot of overlap, so it could be a possible scenario that you only would want to write component tests. You have like a business perspective on the component, and it's really different than from a technical perspective. Of course, you're rendering it in the browser, and you see what's happening, and you can see it, can test the styling as well. So that's also like that's also I think there's a big people component about using it actually.
That's interesting. Yeah, the idea that you don't expect it to navigate to, you click a link and you're not going to go to another page because you're not on a page in the first place. You're isolated.
Exactly.
You brought up what was going to be my next question. Murat, we'll come around to you again and do the same circle. Which is having component testing in the browser, like in Cypress, and writing user-focused tests this way, does that change the approach to unit testing, kind of front-end business logic? This is a question I get a lot, and I think someone had just posted as well earlier today, of like, what's the relationship between component tests and unit tests? Are they the same thing? How do you deal with this question, Murat?
Well, like when you take a component as your smallest unit, right, sometimes you may be lacking testing in things that don't render into a DOM, right? So I think those are good fits for not using component testing. You can still use Cypress for them, but we prefer to use just because it's kind of cheaper not to start a browser. So if you have that kind of logic, and honestly, we don't have that much of it left after having component tests, then that's where you cover your business cases. And it's not that much, really just pure functions here and there. After that, once you start component testing, well, you realize that you've kind of covered this detail elsewhere, right? So you can just test your component at a higher level generically. Like, it used to be pretty adamant about testing the props being rendered into the component. Hey, does my component have these props when I mount it a certain way, for instance, right? But now that perspective has changed. When I have used these kind of props, what does my component render and how does it get used, right? So the testing perspective has become more black box, I'd say, with component tests.
Cool. And so for Philip, maybe in the more beginner focused mindset, the unit testing question does not come up so early, but have you had any experience with it, with people asking about Cypress component testing versus unit testing?
Well, people are curious because it's a new thing in the whole Cypress area. So the way I like to explain that is take an example of a login form, where usually a testing approach that can be taken for example, validators, whether the email is valid, the password is long enough, etc. The approach can be to go into that sort of with the end-to-end mindset, right? So one test would be a valid inputs, the other one will be short password, the other test will be wrong email, etc. And you end up with like 12 different tests for essentially a UI validator that can even happen on API. I think what I like to point out that component test is a great candidate for this, because you don't need to load the whole page with not only the login form, but maybe some scripts in the background and whatnot. So your test can be faster. You can iterate through that much easier. And it's actually a better thing to do than try to open the whole application and try all these different scenarios. And that resembles kind of a unit testing, or maybe more precisely like a granular testing approach when you want to validate data and make sure that some front-end behavior works as it should. So so something like that usually gets pointed out.
Okay, cool. And then Paul, for you as well, unit testing, component testing. How does that work?
Yeah, so what I said earlier, sometimes you can exchange the two because they do have a different scoping, of course. I think component testing is very interesting from a shift left perspective, of course, that you can also use for demonstrations of what you're delivering when you're working you're doing demo for your organization. But it also requires like a certain seniority of your engineers, your test engineers, and your developers as well. So I think it should be like an organic approach. So yeah, first you start out, people are writing unit tests. Often testers don't have like a good insight in what quality and how many unit tests there are. So you can write the component test next to them. And from my experience, you can then have a discussion about, what are you writing? And your component tests are also going through the pull request cycle. So the developers look at your component test as well, and they'll see similarities or not. And then you have the discussion about, should we go for one or should we go for both? And yeah, set a border on you do this and I do that. That's actually how I feel about it.
Okay, cool. So next one, I will start with Philip, and I want to do sort of one question about when not to use component testing. Philip, you wrote a very popular API testing plugin, and you're familiar with the use of Cypress for end-to-end and component testing. So the question I get a lot is about strategy. It's like, okay, cool. We could push component testing to its limits and do almost everything through there. And that's possible, but is that valuable? What about these other forms of testing? So Philip, for you, what do you prefer? What do you recommend testing outside of component testing at the API or the end-to-end level?
Yeah, I think there's no good answer into like terms of one size fits all. So you greatly pointed out that this is a strategy question, and that's going to heavily depend on various things, like what kind of app we are testing, how much are we in control of the data, is it okay if we mock things, is it better, is the application like API heavy, so it would make sense to focus more on API testing. And to answer all those questions, you need to find like a certain balance. And I think there are definitely ways where you want to lean more into API testing than into component testing. I think those cases might include applications that are sort of data heavy. If you want to do some sort of security checks on API, then just going with requests might be a better way. And then also, I think relying on end-to-end tests is really good if you want to copy like a critical user scenario, sort of end-to-end, where you want to catch a user story and you want to make sure that user story works at all times. Those business critical things, I think end-to-end tests will always be like the best approach here. But again, I started by saying this will depend on the application. But as a common sense approach, I think going where the biggest risk is, that would be a place to be covered really well. And usually end-to-end tests do a good job with like having a little amount of code to test a whole lot of your application. And you can see that if you for example, set up your code coverage, either for component tests or end-to-end tests, just by opening an application can sometimes give you like a 60% coverage. And that should tell you something, right? You would not get that coverage by opening a single component. So yeah, I guess it's a sort of a non-answer because I answered it with what you said in your question. The balance needs to be found.
Yeah, I think you added a lot about how to think about the balance. So thank you for that. And so, Paul, yeah, is there anything that you recommend testing outside of component tests?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I found one of the big benefits of the great benefits of Cypress was that I could test the front end isolated, because my interpretation was always, why should I only test APIs independently and not the front end as well? Because end to end, like Philip says, has a lot of benefits, especially if you are testing customer journeys, and especially if you want to show to your stakeholders, and that you can test the handshake between the front end and the back end, of course. But why shouldn't it be layered? And component testing is, of course, the next step in that case. So I think you need all. I think it's like you do need to test your APIs separately. You need your components to test them separately too. But you might want to test them working together as well. So it can be when they're published to a website. But if you're like myself, creating a component library to be used by others, what we did there was we actually created well, it was something it was shown today, I think, but we created like an orchestration between different components to see how they behave together, and they were loaded separately, so not in the application itself, but still. So you want to test things working together, but you also want to test them independently to be in complete control. And I think end-to-end tests should be 20% of the entire set of tests that you're using, because they also require a lot of maintenance often. So
cool. Yeah, thank you very much for that. And Murat, for you and your experience, is there anything that you prefer to test outside of component testing?
So when I was working on a few applications, trying things out, I came to the conclusion that state management and global state management of your application and routing was a nice border between component testing and higher level tests. So I was advised test all you can at component level, and when you can't, move up a level, right? Move up meaning end-to-end with stub network. We call that UI integration testing. So Paul was referring to that a lot. And when you need to backend, use a UI end-to-end test. But as we were using more and more component tests at extent, it became to many components that's only getting its data from the URL. Right, so we needed a nicer way, but because the component really doesn't do anything besides getting some data from the URL and rendering it. So we needed to find a way to test these effectively, and we looked at what React Router did, and we replicated their approach. I have a video on this, and we use this now everywhere. In fact, it's one of our custom mounts. Right, so you can test a lot of routing there. But when it's state management between different components, right? So maybe you have unrelated components, so that's a nice way to implement UI integration testing. You can also do what Lachlan was recommending, like a custom wrapper component, putting multiple components in there. We do that a lot in our component testing library. So how would multiple components would get used together in my application component, but in the real component, it's kind of like a contrived test if you approach it that way. Sometimes we do it, but it's usually contrived. So with those, I would lean into UI integration tests, so end-to-end marking it up, right? We are assuming that, and this is our test strategy, that each one of our services, we have so many, 44 AWS services, are extensively tested where their code lives, the API end-to-end test. So with this, we have the confidence to say that I don't have to use my UI client to test my backend. So I think this is a big anti-pattern. Whatever service you're providing, you have to make sure, and you have to test this early before you deploy to higher deployments. You have to make sure that you have this confidence before you release it, before you have others test your service for you, right? It doesn't matter if it's one service serving one application. You still have to make sure your service is there. Assuming we have this API end-to-end tests, there's less and less UI end-to-end tests that we need. So it really becomes a pain, right? Usually the proportion that we see is 3 to 5 component tests to 1 UI integration test to even less UI end-to-end tests.
Okay, great. So we'll begin to wrap up the discussion. I will ask one kind of final short question about, the main benefit or your favorite aspect of component testing. And then after that as well, I'd like to give you each a chance to sort of sign off, maybe tell us a good way for people to reach you, or if there is resources or anything like that that you would like, that we can add to the resource document that I'm about to share in a second. We'll send that out afterwards to people who weren't able to join the call, and it will be a way for people to to follow up individually, with specific things. So if you have something to plug, that would be a good time. But let's first start with Paul. We can have you go first this time and talk about what is your favorite thing or most useful thing about component testing.
That's a good question. I do like. I do believe that things like component testing actually help making testing more a part of the software development lifecycle, and it doesn't only challenge the testers to do their work differently and more on a technical level, so they'll be speaking more the same language as developers. It also challenges developers about how they set up their components and what strategies they're using for that. Because when you start writing your component tests, it will be very transparent for everyone to see how components are behaving, also in orchestration together. So yeah, I think that's one of the biggest benefits, is that you're testing faster, earlier, but also you're learning from each other on a very low level. So you're working much closer together, and that's actually why I also opted for using different testing strategies or techniques, because how earlier you can test in the process, how better it is for quality altogether, I think.
Cool, thank you. And Philip, then your favorite aspect of component testing?
Well, I guess I'm going to finish just the way I started. I really like, so it's been a new area for me, and I have really enjoyed learning all about it. So I think that's kind of the most fun part for me. And it opened up doors for being even a better companion to our developer friends. Especially now that I don't only have the input of from an end-to-end perspective, but I can actually point out places and components where something is not right. I even got to fixing my first bug in a component, because I was able to tell that this is not right and it should be like this. So it's an enjoyable experience in this aspect as well. I know this is not the main thing for component testing, but me personally, I have been enjoying this part quite a lot. So I encourage anyone who's sort of hesitating to dive into it because it feels too technical or it feels too advanced. Don't be afraid. Call your colleagues in, the ones that maybe have written the code, and I promise it's going to be quite fulfilling experience.
Okay, cool. And Murat, same question to you.
My favorite thing about component testing is the observability of the components we provided in isolation. You see everything to do with your component without any of the noise. You can diagnose any issues, because at the end, it's about the feedback, right? We're always learning. We're learning more about the things that we're doing. That all depends on iterative feedback. And engineering is about learning, right? We don't have all the answers already. We're always learning, and good engineers, world-class engineers, they will optimize the way they are learning. If you can accelerate the way you're learning things, you will accelerate your productivity with any of the tools. This is why I say component testing transforms your development experience. It transforms your development engineering.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so let's sign off then, and I'll start again with you, Murat, for this. Let us know for people good ways to reach you. And I want to say thank you so much to all three of you for participating. I know we are an international group. We're dealing with many issues related to time zones and life that you made room for this conversation. So I really appreciate it. And yeah, Paul, why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Well, people can find me, of course, in the Discord channel. Also, I'm on LinkedIn, and sometimes I write on Medium and also on Twitter. I think that's it. And I'm always happy to help others. I like to teach as well. So give me a shout if you need any help or advice or anything. Always happy.
Great. Murat, I said I would start with you. I didn't. I'm not sure why, but now we can move on to you.
So I shared the link to my presentation, and it has my contact to LinkedIn and my GitHub profile and Twitter. It doesn't have my YouTube, but there's some videos there. It has the same handle as my Twitter, so you can take a look at my videos. I think it's the same handle on Dev2. Bunch of blog posts there. And you can use the presentation as a cheat sheet if you want to present component testing to your organization, or you want to see the differences between RTL and SciCT and check out all the resources. Of course, you can reach me on Discord too. That's all.
Very cool. And then Philip, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Well, you can find everything I do on my homepage. I just entered it into chat. It's philipritz.com. I write blogs about Cypress, and I'm preparing some more topics as well. So if you want to check this out or connect with me on Twitter or LinkedIn, I'd be happy to connect.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. All right, I'm going to share my screen again, and we'll just kind of summarize what we've learned today and talk about next steps for people who are considering getting started. So this resource sheet is there again. It's okay. We're going to send it out afterwards anyway. I'm sure anybody who's interested has kind of gotten to that. There are more questions appearing in the chat, sort of late breaking. I think we need to take those to Discord. Some of them are giving me ideas for demos or kind of head-to-head comparisons that maybe could exist. So Cypress versus Storybook, or like Cypress as a presentation, like Paul mentioned, like using it to show work in progress in component testing. Those are all interesting discussions, but they're very deep because the tools are oriented in completely different ways. And in some cases, there is overlap, and in some cases, there's no overlap at all. So it doesn't make sense to compare them. And that's content that we can move into discussions on Discord. So looking back at kind of what we covered today, from Lachlan, we saw a pretty wide-ranging presentation that told us about kind of the pyramid and where component testing fits in, but also dove deep. If anybody has joined late, this dives deep into like an increasingly complex series of component tests for one feature in Cypress. And it talks about the logic and the reasoning around why we tested this debug page feature in this way. For my presentation, we covered accessibility and the user's perspective in component tests. This is certainly the way I think about them, as being very narrow and deep and prescriptive about what exactly is happening in the component and what it renders. And then in end-to-end testing, going at a more high-level test of a user journey. In Chris Baus's presentation, we talked about engineering leadership and management and how component testing, maybe aside from the technical details, how does it impact a team's productivity, a team's ability to deliver or to adapt? And Murat told us all about React Testing Library. Murat has an extensive collection of resources you can check out. There's so much there. And that presentation will be good, as people have said, to watch back, because it touched on a lot of things that might be interesting. But on anything that he talked about, you can also dive deep into the examples and the repositories and books and things that he provides. And then, yeah, again, I appreciate people participating in the roundtable. I think it gave me some interesting insights into different scenarios that people might test components in, working with clients, working with your own teams, working with like teaching. So really appreciate everyone's involvement there. If you want to get started, this is all that you need to do. So if you have a project that does not have Cypress installed yet, or you just open a new folder, you can install Cypress with one command, open it, and choose component testing. And that's the first of your 5 clicks to go through the wizard that will install and set up CT for you. So it is not as complex as it might seem to get Cypress to understand your framework and to like choose the right thing and have Cypress running a component test. And that gets you into the initial setup flow. So I just wanted to emphasize this is a relatively low effort thing to kick the tires on. As Philip mentioned, in your app, you may have complex dependencies of your components that have to be figured out. So stick with us, ask on Discord if you're having like a problem with CSS or something like that. A lot of people have been there before, and usually it's set and forget. So once you are through the necessary dependencies of like, oh yeah, my app always needs a global wrapper component that renders things. Once you get that stuff sorted out, that stuff generally stays stable for a very long time. So it's worth checking it out. There's quick start docs for React, Angular, Vue, and Svelte, which are the built-in frameworks that work with Cypress component testing. And there's also like within our docs, because we didn't mention Angular specifically. Jordan Powell on the component testing team is off today. Otherwise, he would have absolutely had an Angular presentation. But I want to share something he did from like, yeah, this is here. This is from this.media, and he's done presentations at Angular conferences you can Google. So Jordan's on our team. He's fantastic. And there's also a blog post to call out by Christian here, which is a perspective on component testing we didn't really cover today, which leans very heavily into component testing. And we don't know each other. I haven't met Christian, but I just found this blog post recently and I thought it was a really interesting take. So that is here in this document, which is what that QR code has been linking to. There's a lot of other stuff in there, and I think we intend to add a little bit more to this and make it available along with the recording after the webinar is completed. So Discord is where to find us, people that presented in this, and find each other if you're getting started. There are definitely people who are also in the same spot as you. There are people who have never used component testing before, who are going to go write their first React component test after this. We know that because you all answered some questions when you signed up. So there is definitely people who are going through exactly the same thing as you get started. So if you join the Discord, you can speak to each other and help resolve questions and theories and things you might want to think about. We have all those resources that are there. The Cypress docs are also extensive. I didn't lean heavily into those in this presentation, but there's a lot of documentation around component testing. And I'll leave this slide up here. Jess, I'm not sure if you would like to sort of take us home and say anything about future communication around Cypress support, but this is the information about where to kind of get support. If you are using Cypress Cloud, you have access to paid support channels. Otherwise, you have these community places like we kind of talked about.
I know, couldn't have said it better myself. Join us on Discord, folks, if you're not there already. In addition to all of the Cypress team members that you've met today and our ambassadors, there's about almost 10,000 of your closest friends, your new closest friends on Discord to provide support and answer questions. So we'll see you there. And after this event, we will send out the webinar recording as well as these resources.